Let's talk about seafood. Now, seafood is one of those intimidating things to a lot of home cooks. I think only because whole fish can be a little freaky sometimes. So before we get to our whole salmon, let's talk about clams, oysters, and mussels. Living here in the Northwest is really an incredible bounty, excuse the expression, but it really does talk about what we do have available. And bounty is the operative word here, because clams, mussels, oysters grow prolifically here in the Northwest waters. What a lot of people don't realize is there's only 3 varieties of oysters. There is the Pacific, also known as the Japanese oyster, the Eastern or Atlantic oyster, and then the Olympia oyster, which does hail from the Puget Sound waters in Washington State. But other than that, those are the 3 main species. Everything else is considered a varietal. So, and those varietals are based upon where they come from. So a Willapa Bay oyster is from Willapa Bay. So let's get into these oysters. These were coming to us from Pacific Seafood, which is my seafood, or my fishmonger, as we like to call them. And I'll just take a minute on fishmongers in general, because I think that that's really pretty critical. When buying fresh fish, and let's talk about oysters and clams, one of the things you're looking for here is, let's pull one out so we can have a frame of reference. Now, these are called Westcott Bays from Westcott, Washington. And what you look for in an oyster is, number one, a nice tight shell. In other words, the oyster is an opening in front of you. It also should smell clean. It should smell like the ocean, because that's where it came from. If it smells fishy, that's an indicator that there's something wrong and you want to stay away from it. The other thing you're looking for on the back of the oyster is the hinge, and that should be a tight hinge. It should be closed really well. And so this, to me, is an oyster that's in pretty good shape. The other thing you're looking for here is barnacles. And/or, just things hanging on the oyster. Barnacles are naturally occurring. And when you're dealing with an oyster, you want to get those barnacles off, but more importantly, the first thing you want to do is just kind of rinse it in some cold tap water. Now, with any type of animal that comes from the ocean, keep in mind that they live in salt water. So when you wash them in tap water, you're literally giving them the opportunity to start ingesting some of that water, and you don't want to do that too far in advance, because they're used to salt water, and that's not what you're using to clean them. And these oysters I love, because as you can see, they are already pretty clean to begin with. If I had barnacles on here, I'd only be concerned about the barnacles that are in the crescent of the oyster. And as you can see, there's a flat surface on top, and then that crescent. The crescent is what we're going to try to maintain when we shuck this, because that's where all the liqueur of the oyster remains, and that's what we're going to actually use to serve the oyster. So all we care about is the barnacles on the bottom. But again, what I'm looking for is any extraneous matter, and I'm going to go ahead and let's just go ahead and shuck this. Now, shucking is not that difficult. We always talk about the tools of the trade, and I have an oyster knife that is probably the creme de la creme, if you will. Fairly inexpensive relative to oyster knives, but it's nice and heavy in my hand. And like any tool you use in the kitchen, which we talk about in the chef's wardrobe, culinary wardrobe section, you want to make sure that it works for you, and that's really what's important. What I like about this is it has a grip underneath the blade, and I have a place to rest my thumb. You can see that it comes to a point, and that point is pretty sharp. So I want to be careful when I'm opening the oyster that I don't cut into myself. I just cut the oyster. Now, cutting the oyster, that's probably the wrong thing to say, because we're not actually going to cut the meat of the oyster. We're going to break the shell in two, or shuck, or separate the two using the hinge. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using the point of my knife to come in under the hinge and pop it. And literally, as I take my time, you can actually hear that little suction pop as I release the shell. So I'm going to put it onto a towel, and I'm going to put half of that towel on top. That really locks and loads my oyster, keeping it in place. Come in underneath and pop. Now you can kind of see that the shell shifted, and that's perfect. Now that the shell is shifted, I want to make sure that I maintain the liqueur that's in the oyster. There's going to be a little bit of a hinge where the muscle's connected on the top, and if you're looking at the oyster, it's about 5 o'clock as the clock goes on the oyster shell, on the top and on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that hinge kind of come on up, and I'm going to get my knife in there, and I'm going to separate the muscle just where we talked about. And that will release the top. Now, I can feel it fairly loose. I'm going to take my knife and just go all the way around. And I've got a nice, clean cut. It smells fantastic. Now, what it should smell like? It should smell like the ocean. It shouldn't smell like fish. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and release the rest of the oyster. Remember, there's a hinge on the bottom as well, right again at about 5 o'clock. And that should come up relatively easy, which it does. And now that oyster can move around the shell And if I was just going to serve that, I'd put a little cocktail sauce or granite or something more unusual for my liking, just so that people can say, wow, that was fantastic. Keep in mind, when you serve any type of condiment with an oyster, people are eating the oyster. That's what they're looking for. That's where the flavor should be. It shouldn't be overwhelmed with a cocktail sauce. So condiment really means garnish, small amount. Okay, so this oyster is ready to go. Let's talk about some of these other varieties that we have here. We have the Westcott's. I have another larger oyster. This is called an Effingham oyster. Again, nice clean shell. I like the ridges. It kind of gives some unique plate presentation by having a couple of these. So you've got some good color here. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and rinse in a little bit of cool tap water. The colder the better. And I'm just rubbing my hand around the oyster to make sure that anything that's on there kind of falls off, any extra dirt, sand. And again, we're talking sand, not dirt. Just drain that off. Now, once again, there's really no barnacles. Oh, wait, there's one. It's really tiny. But you know what? Since I'm shucking the oyster and I only care about the bottom section, I don't have to worry about cleaning that barnacle off. It's going to be part of the garbage here in a moment. So, once again, I'm going to put that oyster on my towel. And again, you want to find that nice hinge. And you want to use not a lot of pressure, just enough to get in there. And if the oyster is working with you, like this one is, you have a nice little pop. Now keep in mind, you've got that 5 o'clock combination of where the hinge is. It's a lot easier to open the shell once you've removed the muscle. And I feel pretty confident about that. And I've just cut the muscle. And the top shell comes off fairly cleanly. Again, coming underneath. Again at 5 o'clock. And the bottom is released. Now, unlike the Westcott Bay oyster, where you have a little bit of liqueur here, you've got a lot more liqueur with the Effingham, and that makes, again, for great eating. Now, once again, you want to smell the oyster. You always want to smell it before you pop it down on the plate because you want to make sure it smells like the ocean. Again, that's a nice, clean ocean smell, not fishy. So we're looking pretty good. Now, I'm going to go ahead and grab a clam. We'll show you how we do the clam as well. Clams here in the Northwest are somewhat of an anomaly to me. It seems that all we do with them is cook them, steam them with vegetables and various aromatics, serve them with some white wine and bread. And don't get me wrong, that's a great meal. But on the East Coast, where I'm from, we would shuck clams and eat them just like we do oysters. So for the sake of discussion, I'm going to go ahead and show you how you shuck a clam. A lot easier to shuck than an oyster. What you want to do is have a good clam knife. And if you don't have a good clam knife, you don't want to use a steak knife or any other knife. You really need the right tools for the job here. I'm going to take the clam and I'm going to pop it in a towel. And what I'm going to do is expose the top ridge. So one more time, the hinge of the clam in this case is what's in the towel. Using my clam knife, I'm coming in on the top and I'm separating the shell. And I'm coming through all the way to the bottom. Now, unlike an oyster, it's virtually impossible to pull the clam out without serrating it a little bit. So once I break that shell open, I like to come in with my knife and scoop out that meat so it rests clearly on the bottom. And as you can see, it comes out fairly easily. And I can just break that hinge fairly cleanly. And then we have a nicely shucked clam. Now, what we want to do is we want to come up underneath because the clam hinge is actually towards the back. The muscle is towards the back where the hinge lies. And again, it should smell like the ocean. It shouldn't smell fishy. And we've got a nice half-shucked clam. Okay, so what we're going to do on our final piece of shellfish here is I'm going to grab a knife and open up our mussels. Now, unlike the clams, the mussel tags are usually stuck in here with the netting. Let me just grab that out, and we can talk about that. Now, you'll see that I talked about shellfish tags. Shellfish tags come on the outside of the package as well as the inside commercially. And I've got from, again, Pacific Seafood, I've got a great mussel, and these are called cultured Atlantic mussels. Now, they're not from the Atlantic. This just happens to be the name of them. They're cultured, and from a cultured standpoint, what that means is they actually seed the beds. Now, that's a topic for a whole nother video, but seeding the beds basically is ensuring that from year after year after year, you've got good mussel development. So, on a mussel, a couple things you look for. Once again, like a clam, you want to look at them, you want to make sure they have a tight shell. If there's any extraneous matter, and these actually are looking pretty clean, so let me see if I can find one that isn't as clean. You know, if I was doing this in my restaurant, then I would find a lot that wasn't clean, and of course now we're not finding it. But here's a good example. Rinse it in water, and there's little filaments of actually seaweed and part of the connective tissue of the muscle on here, and it's pretty fine, so it's hard to see. A lot of times you may have this referred to as the beard of the muscle. Again, like with all fish, you want to prep this prior to service so you don't damage the actual meat and you have it as fresh as possible. But when you pull this beard out of the muscle, what's happening many times is you're actually pulling some of the meat out, and that will kill the muscle fairly instantly. So you want to be very gentle. You want to pull ever so slightly, just so that you break it away from the shell. And it looks like this was thin enough that it really didn't make any dent into the muscle. And now I've got a clean shell. And again, like the clams and oysters, you want to make sure it's free of any debris and any barnacles. Otherwise, we're pretty much good to go.